hit the record button. Welcome, everybody. My name is Hamid. I go by he, him with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Welcome to our third Tuesday of the month community meeting, which we are meeting on Zoom. This is since COVID started, we had to pivot and move from our in-person meetings at our home in LA Can and Skid Row, our weekly meetings to Zoom. We kind of been trying some hybrid stuff as well, but the surges are not letting up. So I guess this is almost like, I hate to say that, but at this moment, it's almost like a new normal. So that we just gotta just navigate. But happy to be here, happy to see folks joining us. If you can take a second, please take a second on chat if you'd like to introduce yourself, your name, pronouns, and if you're with any organization. So we're gonna get started. So this is our general meeting, the third Tuesday of the month, and the way the coalition has organized these community meetings that each Tuesday, at least the 4 Tuesdays of each month, we hold these meetings, and the first Tuesday is committed for a community meeting to look at the intersection of the national security police state and how it intersects with the gender and sexuality, how it impacts folks. We've been looking at a lot of different things, how with these legislations and various assaults that are going on in trans youth, how surveillance plays a part, what's going on with the impact on sex workers, and on and on and on. The second Tuesday of the month is committed to looking at the intersection of the national security police state and the coalition's fight against the war on youth, and that how youth are being impacted, how surveillance and the stalker state continues to engage in violence, continues to advance programs that continue to criminalize and to contain and control young people. So that's that, which is co-led by Akhil and Nadia in partnership with Palestinian Youth Movement and Black Alliance for Just Immigration. The first Tuesday, Gender and Sexuality, is co-led by Chela and Mariela, and increasingly with Kim, and then of course the four of us on top of the screen, Matios, Hamid, Dina, and Shakir, are here in support to the community. Now the third Tuesday is our general meeting, where we kind of look at the current political moment and the overall impact around surveillance and the information sharing environment. And the fourth Tuesday is committed to looking at data-driven policing and how that is expanding, and how this whole facade of pseudoscience around predictive analytics and risk assessments and various other things are being promoted. So today, we wanted to kind of just go back to basics. I mean, something that the coalition has built its work upon around surveillance. And one of the key elements of surveillance that doesn't get much talked about, which has been codified over time, especially behavioral surveillance. And for folks who are not familiar with the behavioral surveillance, I mean, it's nothing, there's no, just a science to that thing. It's just basically, somebody acting weird, somebody acting strange, somebody looking suspicious, somebody who doesn't belong here, somebody who looks like a stranger, right? And this may not be spelled out in policing programs like that, or just exactly to the T like that, but that's the underlying goal when, when we have programs all across, like See Something, Say Something, which actively go and recruit community members to be snitches and to be informants. LAPD's program is called iWatch, small I and WATCH. The Sheriff's Department is called Tips and Leads, so various things. But then when you add on the multiple layers of various other ways that the community is constantly being recruited, just back in 2019, early 2019, LAPD launched a program calling them 10,000 Eyes and Ears, or 5,000 Sets of Eyes, which they actively were looking for volunteers to staff, the neighborhood patrols and be volunteers. And it was also, and they gave them the power that they can basically call the cops on people and hold people. And I mean, just whatever, just kind of make people's lives miserable. Then, of course, we have neighborhood watches, and then we have other technology-based stuff that is quite pervasive, where nextdoor.com is another tool that is being used to communicate amongst people, and then increasingly the use of ring technology, how that information is being gathered. So that's the conversation we want to have today, but really not just about just how people are seeing that, but what is the potential impact of harm? And given the political moment that we are in, given how reproductive health is roundly being criminalized, access to abortion, access to just bodily autonomy, so for persons especially who are having babies. Then also like how queer trans youth are being impacted. And now we are at a stage, and I'm not a lawyer, but just basic understanding that how these laws are being passed, and now they are criminalizing any support from people as well. So aiding and abetting of individuals or people who are seeking support is being criminalized as well. I mean, I'm reminded of some not too long ago, just about 11, 12 years ago, the Arizona immigration bill, SB 1070, where aiding and abetting was very much a part and parcel if you were to call out if you saw an undocumented immigrant. I mean, there were cases like somebody going to a dentist, and the dentist called the cops because this person happened to be an undocumented immigrant. So that's when we talk about the police state, and how surveillance is situated in that police state. It's not just about the law enforcement, or it's not about only about COINTELPRO or the NSA or the FBI. This is a huge both infrastructure and a huge landscape that is being constructed, and in which just community informants are a key part of that. Again, nothing new. So that's the kind of, we wanted to just have this conversation, that how people are thinking about it and where are they at. So I'll pause there for a second, but just to open it up to see if people want to share their experiences of what they may have seen in their neighborhoods, just as a sort of like a surveillance mechanism that may be set up in the neighborhoods, or they may have seen actually out on the street people being harassed as a result of somebody just walking out. We know people get murdered. Ahmaud Arbery, just out there running in the local neighborhood in Atlanta. And next thing you know, the claim was that, he looks like somebody who broke into that house, or, just into the neighborhood. And then the person is murdered. Just Trayvon Martin, just walking back with some groceries, going home. And next thing you know, this person doesn't look. So the point here being that it is these kind of things are not just only licensed to racially profile, but they are pretty much, licensed to even cause extreme harm to people as well. So we'll stop there. Just chat is open, and please, if you want to raise your hand, or if you and mics are open, are available too. So let's just get this conversation started, because what we want to do is to come up with a collective plan. We want to come up with how do we fight back? So that's going to be the first part of this conversation. Then I'm going to be handing it over to my comrade Shakir, who's going to talk about and lift some of the stuff from our report that we released, Automating Banishment, in November of last year, the surveillance and policing of looted land, and Section 6, which really looks at reform and this whole disease of reform that socially we are suffering from, seeking remedies through that, and looking at community policing. And then we'll have Martios and Nina share some of the stuff about a survey that we are doing on counterinsurgency and community policing, and a zine that is in the works as well. So again, there's a third time I'm saying I'm going to pause there. So please, I'll open it up, and just feel free to share any thoughts about behavioral surveillance, and what do you see out there? Anybody?
I'd like to say something, if that's all right.
Please.
So about 5 years ago, I had friends over. We walked up to the main spring area to get something to eat. And we were walking back to my place, which is on 7th and Central. And we were making our way right through Skid Row. And there were three of us. And the cops pulled us over and asked us if we knew where we were. And I said, well, yeah, I know where I am. I'm in my neighborhood and I'm walking home. I live 2 blocks from here. Why are you asking us if we know where we are? And I pointed across the street to a group of Black people. I said, why don't you ask them if they know where they are? Why did you pull us over to want to know if we knew where we are? And of course, there was no answer given, but it was a perfect example of the systemic racism that runs rampant through our community here in Skid Row. And I can't be the only white guy with 2 friends that gets pulled over and asked, by the cops, if I know where I am, if we know where we are. Like, white people aren't really supposed to be hanging out down here or walking through or going home, living down here. I mean, so I don't know if this is has anything to do with what tonight's topic is, but that's an experience I had. And it was before I got involved with LA CAN, so I wasn't as educated as I am now. And I probably would have been much more smart-assy to the cops had I known what I know, had I known then what I know now. And it's something that really obviously I've been forgotten and has weighed heavily on me. Reminding me that, this color of my skin comes with all these privileges, because in the cops' minds, I think they were literally under the impression they were protecting me and serving me.
Mhm.
And I wasn't under that impression.
Thank you. Thank you, Elliot. Yeah, absolutely. Happens all the time. Other experiences.
Yes, can I pipe in?
Please go ahead.
Sure. This may be a relatively minor thing, but my experience.
John, we can't hear you. You're coming in very, very faint.
Can you hear me better now?
It's a little better. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'll try to pipe up to the best of my ability.
Sure.
On 2 separate occasions in the last few years, I've noticed automatic license plate readers attached to stop signs in my neighborhood. One was about a block north of where I live. It's a residential area in Los Feliz. And one was a block west. And it was my intention in both cases to come back the next morning and take photos of them and send them to the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco. But by next morning, both were gone. So I guess my advice is, if you want to see and photograph one of those things, don't be as lazy as I was.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for making a note of that too. I think that's also important. So absolutely. And for folks who may not know, I mean, at least the previous ones that we have, just posted on our website, those, some estimates were that they had like 1,000 hits a minute. So, about the license plate readers. So yeah, these are really big technologies. So thank you. Other experiences. Hard to believe nobody else has or observed. All right. Cool. Yeah, go ahead, Shakir.
Yeah, I don't have anything new to share, but I just wanted to kind of just thinking about what Elliot is saying, and that role. I mean, it's kind of previewing a little bit of what I think we want to talk about both the behavioral surveillance and the community policing. Is like that experience there is just an example of like police have their not just even personal sense, but like kind of structural commitment to like, maintaining who belongs in a neighborhood, who belongs on this side of the street versus that side of the street, this side of town versus that side of town. And that's the function they're playing. And that's a function of community policing, of like them mapping out, you know, their logic of who should be where, what should be going on where, and then literally enforcing that on the streets. And obviously there are senses of that, and we know they're obviously going to be shaped by the basics of segregation and you know, racial division, the kind of the histories of redlining and stuff in the city that even comes down to a block by block level. But then especially, and I forget exactly what you said you were, Elliot, but you know, like even as neighborhoods are transforming, and they're not transforming accidentally, they're transforming like through the deliberate, you know, efforts of real estate developers, police, city officials. And that's a lot of what our latest automating banishment kind of gets at, is even at the block by block level, the police are targeting this location and trying to transform it. That too, like, and so in Skid Row and on the edges of Skid Row, which obviously have over the years, we're especially seeing that with this use of data to maintain, and use of even those kind of patrols and stuff to maintain those borders of, oh, that looks like a person who belongs on that side of, you know, Main Street versus on the other side. So it's there, like police are, and we've talked about this, that the data helps them, even though there isn't a physical wall between Skid Row and the, you know, in the arts district or the gentrifying parts, or the, you know, the downtown, the other side, towards the west, like that's, like that, this kind of data helps maintain those patrols and maintain, like, okay, like they're making sure to patrol right along those edges and right along those key corridors, to maintain that kind of segregation and division.
Certainly. I mean, policing segregation and redlining and Jim Crow through surveillance has always been the primary thing. And I'm reminded of even when people going back 300 years, there were lantern laws in New York City where people had to walk with a lantern at night if you were a non-white person, just to identify yourself as a suspicious or a threat, or, you know, just, yeah, to the system. So absolutely. Reading this comment from Adam makes me about LAPD pushing the continued expansion of Community Police Advisory Board, CPAB. That seems very much like a response of LAPD to the 2020 uprisings and the different ways to think about what the interventions are and what they're trying to make with CPAB versus how they sell it to the public. Absolutely. Adam, do you want to speak more about it? Kind of can't. Okay, cool. No worries. Absolutely. And Brad, you said, yeah, cops enforce racialized borders. Absolutely. Any additional thoughts on that? What's your experience been? And if you've seen stuff, just like Elliot was sharing?
Yeah, no, that was just kind of to echo what Shakir was saying, and going off of that, you know, the police are enforcing these kind of racialized borders and boundaries, and they themselves are kind of a manifestation of that border and that white supremacist state functioning as such. So yeah, just wanted to echo off of that.
Thank you.
I also wanted to kind of follow up on that. And
Please.
How these borders are also not only racialized, but gendered and sexed, right? In the way that we think. For example, the way that the gang injunction in Echo Park worked was that you couldn't wear any like Dodger gear or have any Aztec tattoos, which are very much, right, a symbol of a certain kind of masculinity that was seen as unacceptable versus, I'm sure if you saw a white dude with a Dodger cap, you know, it's no big deal and they wouldn't be subject to be stopped under those suspicions. So thinking about like what forms of masculinity and femininity are seen as normalized or safe, and what forms aren't. And I think oftentimes we don't really think about gender, we just kind of focus on race. But even when we look at, right, racialized men, we're still thinking about a certain type of gender performance that is deemed unsafe for like historical reasons, for whatever anxieties that society is dealing with. So I think that's always something that's in the back of my mind.
Certainly. Thank you, Kim, very much so. I mean, just the biggest fight, and I remember a huge fight was for just if you were gay and if you were found with a condom in your pocket, then you're being harassed for being a sex worker. And then, just especially if you were a person, non-white person. I mean, there was so many stories about that as well, constantly being harassed and threatened and intimidated, and which leads to, almost like a public display and a public mockery of an individual. And it's not a good feeling. I mean, whether it's on the street. I personally had my own experience right after, in July of 2002, after 9/11, in an airplane where, just going to New York. I mean, ironically, going to New York for a human rights conference. And the airplane just stops on the taxiway as it's heading for takeoff. And then, the flight attendant comes running to me and asks me if I was sitting in my seat. And I'm like, this is a very odd question to ask. Of course, I'm sitting in my seat. The airplane is in motion. So what do you mean if I'm sitting? And I knew. So a couple times that happened. And I finally asked him, I says, what's up? Like, just why are you doing this? And she was pretty forthright. She goes, see that person sitting in the up like 2 rows up on the corner, and it was some blonde white woman who was just basically said she doesn't like the way you look. Okay, there's a lot of people who maybe think like that, but it's not really. I mean, it's an odd fucking moment to be in there. I mean, you'll just, yeah, exactly, sitting while Pakistani. So there you go. And it's just one of those things where, just everybody's eyes are on you. It becomes a spectacle, and everybody's an audience, and you're like, okay, well, this too shall pass. But it is very much so. So any other thoughts? Anybody else wants to share an experience?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, to think about how like it looks with different, like with all of our intersecting identities, also like naming like substance use as well, and how like it becomes a like either through community policing. So whether it's your neighbor calling the cops, or a teacher, whatever it may look like, how it could lead to cops harassing and criminalizing, or folks catching cases because certain behaviors aren't considered acceptable. So I remember like in high school, someone calling the cops saying like, oh, these group of kids are going to go and drink, and how like that ended up giving a license to the cops to snoop around the neighborhood to look for a group of youth, and then to come into our homes without like care about like what that processes looks like, or as well like frisking folks, and it was predominantly brown femmes. So just how like community policing and just like what our ideas are of how someone should be like acceptable within like the settler colony logic, and how like it gives license to anyone who kind of deviates from that to either be called to call like state power and state like the police when we don't agree with whatever behaviors we think are unacceptable.
Absolutely. And Elliot has a comment here that sitting on a plane cuddling with your same-sex partner is a real hoot. I guess, yeah, that's absolutely nice. Yeah, go ahead, Shakir.
Yeah, sorry, one more thing. I know I already just talked, but, and this is just building on the same discussion, is, thinking about this, what we're talking about like sort of different neighborhoods and what kinds of identities or even like performances of identity or how you look and what you seem is how you're policed. I think that that kind of reminds me of kind of this talking point that I feel like we kind of often hear when people are describing abolition, of they make this point that, if you want to have a sense of what abolition looks like, what a world without police might look like, you should look at, for example, like rich kind of white neighborhoods where there aren't police. Like, look, like, yeah, it's not that hard to imagine. Like, look over in Bel Air or whatever, there's no cops there. And like, I get what people are saying or trying to say when they're making that point, But I think from just hearing all these examples, obviously the examples from Skid Row, but also from other parts of town, and you can imagine, extending that, is it just kind of shows how kind of limited that analysis is and how kind of dumb it is, because in all of those places where you don't physically visibly see a whole bunch of cops harassing all the youth, or cameras and license plate readers everywhere, that's because they were secured through the operation of policing in those places. So just it might be true that that like people, there might be like an art gallery walk or something there where people are drinking on the street and the cops won't bust that up. But if like in a neighborhood, in a wealthy white neighborhood, we all know that if there was a group, a bunch of like black teens or whatever drinking in a park, police would real quick be right there, So it's not like those places should not be thought of in this as an absence of police or an absence of policing or the police state. Rather, they're secured through this kind of, really quick racial enforcement of, oh, what's Elliot doing over here? And the flip side of it too, like we're talking about in other neighborhoods.
Definitely. And Taylor, would you like to speak more about it?
Yeah, I don't have a ton more to add, but I was just thinking a bit about how a lot of what looks like the absence of external policing just kind of manifests through the really I think the kinds of technologies and internal practices that your kind of classic wealthy white neighborhood are employing, whether it's like the kind of Ring doorbell, which Ring partners with hundreds of police departments across the country to protect property and to enforce like surveillance, or I guess deputizing citizens to surveil folks in the neighborhood. So I think a lot of that kind of lack of an external cop car just manifests through these internal practices, through like smart homes and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how deputization takes on different shapes as well. So, and thank you, Akhil, because that's where we were going to go a little bit about so there's how these programs are then formalized. And I just want to take us back maybe about 11 years, what really got the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition started. That was our very first fight, was on what Akhil just posted in the chat about SARS, which is Suspicious Activity Reporting Program. And Suspicious Activity Reporting Program came on the heels of the 9/11 Commission report, which then led to a whole expansion of the whole infrastructure, creating fusion centers and spy centers, where information would be gathered and stored and shared through various agencies, public sector, private sector, corporations, social media, just international agencies on a global level. And it was interesting that what they did and the way they defined suspicious activity was, there are certain things which seem so goddamn absurd that you just don't forget. So I kind of memorized that, and I quote that it's observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning of criminal and or terrorist activity. So now when you break it down, that you're observing somebody's behavior, which is reasonably indicative. And I know we have a couple lawyers on the screen as well, which are still trying to figure out what that term means, whether it has any standard, but it's become a standard, reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning of criminal or terrorist activity. Somebody is thinking about doing something wrong. So in a sense, what they did was, it was a complete sort of a license, and this was where if an LAPD cop, for example, and LAPD was the first agency to adopt that program in the nation back in 2008. And which is now like probably the most widely used surveillance program of any other program in the country, human-based surveillance, of course, the technology and cell phones and all of that are there. But, so that they created a set of suspicious activities, for example, taking photographs in public, using video cameras in public, drawing diagrams of an infrastructure. And we were able to access these suspicious activity reports from the tips and lead program of the sheriff. and some of the most absurdist thing, like really disrupting people's lives. One story was right here in Brentwood, and this was a group of 4 art students from Brentwood Art School who were out on a field trip, just photography. And then so they were stopped. They were questioned by the sheriff's department and the LAPD, and then next thing you know, their information was sent to Joint Terrorism Task Force for further investigation when it goes to these fusion centers. So there was about 1,900 of those, but there have been thousands and thousands of these that have gone up. So then LAPD, right there in October of 2009, then the SAR program started in March of 2007. By October of 2009, these are Bill Bratton's gift to us, started the iWatch See Something, Say Something program, which you may be getting information in your electricity bill or any other thing as well. So these are the things, and it was interesting a few years ago. Then Jamie, who was one of our comrades and leading that predictive policing fight, just found out that how, you have the reasonable suspicion standard, which is articulable fact. And help me out a little bit here, Shakir or Mamta, but this was a reasonably indicative, which was termed as an articulable concern. So now, in a sense, whether that is a term or not, we don't know, but this became used, and I was reminded of that. So, well, first of all, let me just go to Shakir or Mamta or anybody else, that what do you all, first of all, make of it, even in a very structural baseline legal context, when people always jump to invasion of privacy and constitutional rights are being violated, that observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning? Let's just see if that has any meaning.
Yeah, it's a really low standard, and that's the idea, is that this is, whereas there's just roughly kind of higher standards that police have to meet when they want to stop you, question you, search you, even a little bit higher when they want to arrest you, and obviously much higher than that when they want to convict you of a crime, that they've added these, it's almost like just the most watered down possible level for these suspicious activity reports. And so what that does is, that expands kind of the, fishing net or whatever for, what types of activities. And that, when I know Hamid kept reciting it, but just to even say it again, it's behavior reasonably indicative. So like, it's not even behavior that for sure means anything. It's just like, someone could think that it indicates, again, not even that like there's something wrong going on, like I'm not vandalizing something or breaking something or stealing something, not even that, but that of pre-operational planning to do something like that in the future. So it's like behavior that looks like someone might say it's indicative of that person looks like they might be thinking of committing a crime in the future. So obviously, when you create criteria like that, that's going to be used by anybody. It's I mean, just going back to the discussion we're having about people being policed for looking out of place, that's like, that could be reasonably indicative. Like, actually, like maybe Elliot is right that those cops were trying to protect him, but maybe they're also like, what's this white dude doing in this neighborhood? It must be something suspicious, like maybe he's there to, I don't know, sell drugs or something, or like, who knows? Like, so it's that too. And so once the standard is that low, it can literally be just my hunch over someone looks out of place and doesn't really belong here.
Thank you. And definitely, Elliot, it is someone else's perception of your behavior. Mamta, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, feel free to chime in. Yeah, I mean, and so now, so that happens, and then the See Something, Say Something program gets launched. So, so now, remember I was saying it was right after the 9/11 Commission report, and the laws were being passed, and this was about terrorism. This is counterterrorism intelligence gathering bullshit, and a lot of that stuff. So we pushed the LAPD. We started organizing. We were demanding that it end, and so LAPD started doing audits, and they started using race data to do the audits of what was the impact, and what was. I mean, as we shouldn't be surprised, what was very telling about these programs was that year after year, we saw a complete element or just a practice of racial profiling under the guise of these programs. For example, in 2015, I guess, or just year after year, one of these audits showed up that of all these suspicious activity reports that were filed, and this is LAPD, so we're talking about the city of Los Angeles, right? So which has, I think the Black population in the city of LA is just a little over 9%. So now when we started looking at their audits and their numbers, 30.7 or 31% almost of individuals on whom these secret files had been opened were listed as Black, right? So now that's about over 3-to-1 impact on the Black community. I mean, we talk about pretextual stops and all of that now here again, and then where gender was identified, and they were just using women and men. So 50% of the women who were of all the women who were listed, 50% were Black women. So now here it is, a counterterrorism intelligence gathering tool, supposedly, for public safety, which is being used to now recycle the same old thing. And furthermore, when we cut through a lot of this bullshit, what came through every year was that, if not more, anywhere from 75 to 80% of these reports were coming from the See Something, Say Something program or community informants, right? And when we further did a deeper dive and we looked at their divisions that they were coming, Elliot, I don't know how many, if there were mothers, they didn't list the parenting. So when we started looking at the region in LA, overwhelmingly, these reports were coming from the West Side, the West Bureau or the Valley Bureau, which has majority white populations. So now here you have a program which has been given just as, Shakir, I'm thinking, because typically we think of cops as using these reasonable suspicion standards, and you have to detain somebody, and then to arrest you have to have probable cause, and on and on and on. But these kind of just standards of somebody being weird, acting weird, somebody looking shady. So this is the kind of stuff that is going on. And the last few minutes of this section of the conversation today, I want to spend about us talking about that. Where is that leading to in the current political moment? How are people thinking about it? We sometimes get caught up sitting in Los Angeles or in LA area. I'm assuming most of the people, if people call in from outside as well, but at least talking about LA and California, we live in a bubble. Almost like a bubble, because we feel that now nothing is going to happen, and people can have access to abortion, and trans folks are living their lives. Although when you look at the hate crimes and the violence against trans people and all, it is all at a record high in LA, right? And LA and Los Angeles County and greater Southern California area, by the way, has the largest number of hate groups as well. And these are like known hate groups of any other region in the country itself. So yeah, let's talk about it. What does that mean? But before we go there, I'm again going to go back to Shakir and Mamta as well, that there's this whole conversation about interstate travel and the aiding and abetting piece of that. And I don't know whether those laws are already in place, but there is, at least as a layperson, you read these things. How do you all, let's start from that, sort of like an extreme case of that a person has been observed and then they are called in, that maybe they're leaving their state to go get access to reproductive health. What is their defense? How, where does it go?
So I think just as a starting point for these kinds of questions, I think we have to be really wary of even just thinking about what exactly is allowed versus not allowed, because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, and this is the same point that we're making about these standards all being lowered, is even if you are charged with something and you might fight it all the way to court or whatever and be able to prove on some legal thing that actually this is an excessive application of the law, that's not the vast majority of how behavior is being shaped, and that's not, you know, like the that's not when that's actually not how the harm is being caused. That they pass these laws, and I think we saw this, for example, with the all the stuff this past couple of weeks about the 10-year-old who I think went from Ohio to Indiana, or maybe I'm mixing up which direction, to seek an abortion after they were raped. And, you know, there's been, even among the like the attorney general and all kinds of politicians in both places, just conflicting assertions about that's definitely illegal, that's definitely violates the ban, or that wouldn't have violated the ban. And we, you know, the point is all of this uncertainty and ambiguity, and intentionally just, you know, these people are just trying shit. They're just like coming up with laws that might actually, who knows if what, it's not clear what they apply, or whether it would be constitutional to apply them in that way, or, you know, what they'll apply to, but that's obviously having an effect of, you know, if you're a person who's pregnant and are seeking to get an abortion, are you really going to like do a bunch of legal analysis and make decisions based on kind of that choice, or are you going to just think about, you know, what the threat to you is in real kind of terms, not like the threat that would be analyzed at the end of the day in a court setting, you know? So, and that's obviously for true for people who are seeking abortions, just as true for doctors, you know, like doctors are not really trying to test the limits of like what might happen or not happen. The point is they try all these things, and then that serves that serves the ambiguities of that, and all that kind of will serve to coerce people or threaten people, put enough fear in people that they won't be seeking things that, yeah, might technically be lawful if you took your case all the way to the Supreme Court or something. But yeah.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. Other thoughts about how these things are are setting up for, you know, just violence against people as well? Or are people thinking about these things, and how are they thinking about to build community defense? Kim, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know that you've been doing a lot of work on that, and we had this whole conversation the first Tuesday as well. Any thoughts on, you know, what you're hearing about these kind of surveillance mechanisms, and see something, say something, and, you know, various other types of how people are being criminalized and all of that? So how are you thinking about it?
I feel like I'm thinking about just the way that locally people are organizing to try to gain access to abortion.
Can you just speak up just a little bit? We couldn't hear you really well.
Is it working now?
A little bit better, yeah.
Okay, what about now?
No, this is great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just thinking about the way that folks are organizing locally. I was just reading a piece by Dorothy Roberts talking about how how this specifically looks like for the South, because I've heard a lot of people like saying like divest from the South and all these things that are like localizing the struggle to solely the South, while also ignoring the fact that the South has the biggest population of Black Americans. And the various ways that they've been organizing, because these are the same states that have been having like the worst abortion access. And immediately after Roe versus Wade fell, they were the ones that had already, what are they called, trigger bans in place immediately. So the Dorothy Roberts piece that I could share talked about essentially the deaths that are going to be caused because of this. Black maternity rates are 3 times, 4 times more than white birthing people. So it's really difficult to think about this as separate than I don't know. I'm like struggling to find the language to think about this as all together, right? Of how like all of these things, anti-transness, fat phobia, and the ways that we police bodies all stem from anti-Blackness, and how are we organizing, I guess, in the same way that centuries exist, if that makes sense. So yeah, thank you for that question.
No, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And obviously, we're constantly building that fight as well. And then last couple of minutes, I think when we then add a whole lot of the broader architectures of surveillance, John mentioned license plate readers. We're talking about just, Stephen just posted a link to an article about, just about phones. And cell phones and stingrays and all of that, the immense amount of data that is there. And then we're looking at digital receiver technology, we're looking at a very high definition cameras. So yeah, I mean, when the coalition names it as a police state, it's not just like you see cops out there, it's just all across. Yeah, thank you for sharing this article as well. And then when you further add now the expansion of social network analysis and social media monitoring, that's a whole different sort of like a landscape of just surveillance and monitoring people and their conversation as well. And where does that end up? So I think just the idea behind this conversation was that it's not the first conversation, it's not the last conversation, but these are the conversations that we want to continue to have to remind ourselves to learn, to unpack, and to build our fight. We are in the process, and we are in the process of building a whole fight against social media. I don't know, Matios or Nina, do you want to take a minute or so maybe talk about that and about our social media fight?
Sure. Yeah. So we kind of broached the topic of social media for the first time about a month and a half ago at this point, after we did that convening at the Robinson Space with the Brennan Center for Justice, who did this great resource list of third-party tools that LAPD use to monitor social media. And we saw that LAPD was looking for things like Black Lives Matter movements. And apart from those third-party tools, we also saw like instances of this within LAPD's own documents. So I'm thinking immediately about the Echo Park After Action report, where they talk about how they were monitoring Black Lives Matter Pasadena's account, like their feed openly. And yeah, just thinking about also just a myriad of ways that LAPD has, well, even just gathered social media information for FI cards. And so this is something we've kind of seen ramping up. The coalition and Hamid has talked a great deal a lot about social network analysis to begin with. And social media companies are happy to facilitate that. We actually found a video by 77th Division that showed how LAPD could request a freeze on someone's story or their IG story or their Facebook post by submitting a request on Facebook, and they'll happily comply. One of the third-party tools we were looking at, Data Miner, was largely owned by Twitter, and it tracked tweets. So just tracking those connections, naming who's targeted, and it's something we're keeping an eye on.
Thank you. Nina, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing that really comes to mind for social media, it's how they named and I think Matthews named most of the like the real-time surveillance. So them looking at news feeds and sometimes being able to remove someone who was live streaming, to be able to point them out on the bus as they were getting detained because of the live feed monitoring that they were doing, and as well the ongoing or the third parties that are able to extract that data. regardless of whether or not you have it posted on your social media. But how it's really kind of it, like that history, it leads up to something in the social network analysis, which we saw with the mappings of like you see LAPD having and mapping out neighborhoods, which gangs are in those territories, and then mapping out individuals and their networks. So kind of the connections between how these same forms of behavioral surveillance and different data entry points are going to be utilized with regardless of what new technology we have, or whatever next thing we do have in the future, but how it ends up in the eyes of the police state just becoming another data entry point for them to continue to surveil, target, and harm folks in the community.
Thank you both. Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, it just reminded me of 2018 when FOSTA SESTA passed, and how that like impacted sex workers that were based online, or were, what's the word, soliciting online. And it pushed a lot of folks to solicit on the streets, and how we see this also. I feel like using social media also to fuel panics, like the recent fentanyl overdoses by touch, quote unquote. So like cops are like releasing all this footage of them supposedly overdosing on fentanyl just by touching it, even though scientifically that's impossible. And like these videos are obviously made to fuel panic around fentanyl, which then like we consent to police getting more resources to like stop, quote unquote, stop or police fentanyl. And also I feel like overall, I don't like social media has, I feel, progressed so quickly that we don't really know, like I know Signal has been compromised and like Telegram, so nothing's like truly safe, either for like sex workers or like regular civilians. So even thinking about like, I've seen a lot of posts that say like, don't tell on yourself, you know, like don't like turn off your location and all of these things. So I would really love to be part of that social media policing team, and maybe see how certain things particularly impact sex workers, like Snapchat, for example, when like your Snapchat gets reported and stuff, or selling like nudes. And I know it also affects like people in like drug markets and stuff. So how like these tools are being used, but also I don't think it's clear how they're being like used by police. Like I didn't know LAPD can so easily, you know, like stop someone's story, and I'm like, damn, what about people who advertise to that? Like what information are they essentially gaining from us?
Thank you, Kim. Cool. Just to, as I've handed over to Shakir, maybe just one last comment. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit what you just posted about nanotechnology surveillance? Okay, well, all right, cool, no worries. We will look into those technologies. And yes, I mean, you know, these are things that, and thank you, Nick, you've been regularly reminding us of these other forms of harm and you know, just radio waves and various other ways, that microwaves and everything else. You know, there's so many community members who are being directly impacted as a result, both known and unbeknownst to them as well. And especially now, and you know, I can only speak of the community that we are in Skid Row, that how these 5G towers are going up, and the proximity to these 5G towers, and you know, what kind of radio waves and what sort of impact these electronic waves are having on people, and what kind of damage it's going to cause to people's health. So both, whether it's just directly targeted or not, it's still, the target is very much there. So I'll stop there. Folks, please join the fight. And then, you know, as we are building our fight against these surveillance infrastructures and technologies, and just in the same old analog human-based surveillance remains the primary ways that as they keep on continuing. But just at least it's good to know that because of the organizer we've been doing over the last 10, 11 years, we've definitely put a dent on them. We haven't been able to abolish or stop them, but the filing of suspicious activity reports have been scaled back tremendously, going back from on an average of about 500 to 700 a month, or just to almost about a year, to maybe about last year it was 82. So, so similarly, we were able to dismantle the predictive policing program. We were able to keep the drones grounded for a while. So, just it's because, of our collective fight that we're doing that. And this, as a social media fight is building, we'd love for people to join the fight. So please send us an email or a message by our handle or go to the website. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Shakir.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's a good place to transition, because I think part of what I think I'm supposed to talk about today is we've been doing these kind of sessions of drawing from the deep collective analysis that's in our automating banishment report that came out in November, and the work that went into that. We're just kind of doing these community learning sessions on it. And the one today is going to be focused particularly, it's from the very last section of the report, and it's focusing kind of on what has happened as a response to us dismantling some of these programs or succeeding in ending an LAPD program or diverting it or dwindling it or whatever. And to understand that, we really need to look at the whole concept of reform and how over time these systems are constantly being refined, retooled, re-empowered through reform. And so when we talk about abolishing them, that means not just kind of organizing to dismantle specific programs, but also organizing, I think, to confront that whole process of reform and ecosystem of reform that's always going to be there to help produce the latest kind of iteration of what the community fought hard to dismantle. And so as we talk about in the report, there's kind of three strategies that we're seeing with how data-driven policing, and especially these predictive policing programs that we've been mentioning, that the coalition succeeded in dismantling, how those are being retooled, put more resources into them and reshaped, rebranded through the process of reform. So there's three strategies that we talk about in the report, and then we're going to focus today on one of them. So the three strategies are, first, what we call in the report this kind of notion of predictive policing 2.0. And that we say that a little tongue-in-cheek, because it comes from some emails that we uncovered through Public Records Act requests showing LAPD communicating with all these university professors and academics about literally one of these, a law professor emails LAPD saying, hey, like I have some ideas for, and emails Deputy Chief Sean Malinowski, who's the architect of the Operation Laser predictive policing program, saying, hey, I have some ideas for what you can, how you can kind of how you should think about predictive policing 2.0. And he literally says this first iteration, it's catching all this heat for being racist and, being used as a tool of segregation and this notion of predicting crime is so problematic. So maybe instead for the 2.0 version, you can repackage this stuff as not trying to predict crime, but just using data and using technology to make policing more fair and accountable and efficient. Same systems, same inputs. There's actually even a point where he says, the companies, they could even market the same product to different cities, but for a democratic city where they're looking for police accountability and police reform, they could emphasize it as a tool for reform. For a right-wing city, they could promote it as the usual predicting crime type stuff. Literally, same components, just here's a different way to brand it. So that's what we talk about predictive policing 2.0, and that's what we see in LA. And in fact, actually, let me show you. When we were talking about how the Operation Laser and Predpol programs, thanks to community organizing and a broad coalition of opposition, we managed to force LAPD to stop at those programs. But literally the same month that LAPD ended the Operation Laser program in April 2020, they launched what's called, this is the kind of document that's laying out the new program. It's titled Data Informed Community Focused Policing. So you kind of see it here. first of all, this is just a jumble of a bunch of like, reformist bullshit. And once you start getting into the report itself, that's mainly what it is. But it's this concept of using data now, not to predict crime, but to like, make policing more fair and scientific. So that's one. Also implicit in that title aspect, another thing that we organize, another way that we're seeing these things retooled and rebranded is what we call surveillance bureaucracy. And that's, instead of ending these programs, instead of like taking data out of police hands, instead of placing limits on how police can use social media or use automated license plate readers, instead what police are coming up with is like a bureaucratic kind of criteria and process for how to do it, the goal of which is to just legitimize it. It creates a pathway for doing it instead of saying, that's fucked, we don't need that anymore. It's saying, okay, as long as you tick these right, requirements and check these boxes and, do an audit and that kind of stuff, then it's fine. And we're seeing this with the predictive policing stuff. We're literally seeing legislation being passed in certain places that's saying, it's being framed as, oh, this is a ban on predictive policing, but the reality is it's not a ban. Literally, the legislation says you can do a predictive policing technology as long as it meets these kind of scientific criteria for academic, or like peer-reviewed criteria, that kind of thing, which again, no one is taking to the streets demanding that, we have peer-reviewed predictive policing. People are demanding that we defund, dismantle, abolish that stuff. But instead, because of this ecosystem reform that's, comprised of academics, nonprofits, we're seeing all that. And I want to link that to what Hamid was describing earlier, and Akil as well, about the suspicious activity reporting program, that even that you can kind of, even though, we talked about how harmful and dangerous, just that even the standard that like reasonable, behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning for crime, how dangerous that language is. But even that language was originates as a reform. And the idea was that before that, there was, in the post 9/11 era, and this I think was what that 9/11 Commission report and stuff was all about, is there was maybe, initially after 9/11, there was a lot of more just wanton like surveillance and hunting of Muslim and migrant and Indian and Arab populations. And so in response to that, a lot of these reformist advocacy orgs representing those communities, when they should have been saying, yeah, like police should never have this power, national security forces should never have this power. And so they said, why don't you come up with some criteria to make it less, unregulated and wild, instead come up with some like way to standardize it. And that's what these kinds of standards that we were just dissecting earlier come from. They come from an effort to say, let's make it a little more bureaucratic and just clean and technical, when it's the same exact harms. And if anything else, actually it expands it, because instead of having, and I'm not saying it was good before and now it's worse or something, now it's bad. It was bad before, and now in a way it's worse, because now there's this criteria that waters it down, and instead of what was going on before, now police have this like really wide discretion that they can use to target anyone. And in fact, what we know is they're going to use it to target, like we were describing with the, where the reports are coming from, they're going to use it to target the same Black and brown communities that they've always targeted. They're going to use it to target migrants, or you're going to use it to target sex workers. They're going to use it to target poor people. That's mainly what it's being used for. So that's predictive policing, or that's surveillance bureaucracy. And then the final thing, the third thing, and this is what we want to, dive into a little more today, and then we're going to be talking a little bit. I think Matios and Nina are going to share a little bit about some new popular education resources, as well as like a community survey that we're developing on this, is community policing. So again, if you go back to this, what they've rebranded in, they decided to throw in this word of community-focused policing. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing is LAPD kind of combining their data-driven programs with another thing that they've always been kind of on the front lines and a pioneer of. We think of this, we know that data and technologies are something that LAPD is, one of the avant-garde of. They're like literally investing the most and like doing the latest shit and at the frontier of that. Likewise with community policing and LA propaganda efforts, that, this is also a department that has long been coming up with the innovations of community policing and police public relations, and, having a whole staff of several dozen PR personnel. Like that's also something, and working with Hollywood and even inventing the term officer involved shooting that originated in LAPD. That's all also part of the innovation that LAPD has always been, at the front of, along with their use of technology. So that's community policing. I think maybe just for me to pause, community policing is a term that means a lot of things, and in a way just kind of means whatever the fuck police want to sell is like different from something they were doing 5 minutes ago. It's like just a branding tool. But want to hear from the group about, what that term has meant to you. What have you seen that it used for, and what are some examples of community policing that you're aware of? Feel free to just either unmute or share in the mic, but yeah, just, community policing, when you hear that term, either used by police or used by police reformers, what are they talking about, or what are examples that you've seen?
It kind of all depends on which community I'm in. If I'm in my parents' community, where there's no less crime, there's no less drug dealing, there are no less sex trafficking going on out there at the west end of the San Fernando Valley, I don't see the police rolling up and down their streets. Now, if we're talking about my community, Skid Row, it's a whole different thing. I mean, all I see are police cars rolling around the neighborhood. And harassing people and asking people like me if I know where I am. And, it really does depend on what community you're in. And there's so many in Los Angeles that it's going to be very hard to keep track of that, because it's different in every community. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so I think one thing is that it depends on what community, and then specifically it's about enforcing a certain vision of what that community should look like, and who belongs there, who doesn't, as well as developing an awareness really deeply of kind of who knows who in the community, and who the people are who just mapping those networks and mapping kind of relationships in the community. So yeah, that's one piece of it. What else kind of falls under community policing that you've heard about?
I think what comes up like in community policing, I think too how like how other folks are deputized, but in like LAPD or like policing itself, community policing looks like cops showing up with pizza to like say that they are like just giving out food to the community, when in reality they're utilizing that as a way of kind of utilizing that conversation or that experience to extract or get data from folks in the community, or playing basketball in like local neighborhoods, as well as like expanding towards like cadet programs and the grooming and bringing like to normalize that within youth, when we know that there have been several cadet programs and several youth programs led by LAPD that have been disbanded, not only locally but like if you look at different police departments, because of the grooming practices and the like parasitic like nature of the police departments.
Yeah, thank you, Nee. And just to illustrate that, the example you gave, I was just I keep going back to this, but this is what we're kind of focusing on is the evolution of those programs that started from community focused policing. You scroll down to the second page, and like, what is this shit? It's like literally they're like standing around, like what could be going on here? What have you seen of like cops kind of hanging out and like watching some kid skate and watching some kid on guitar? But this is, I think it gets at like kind of two aspects of what we see community policing is. One is propaganda. It's just to put this face on it of, yeah, cops are just, what are they doing? They're walking kids across the street and they're playing basketball and they're handing out sneakers. Like literally LAPD brings these community policing officers over to the police commission to say something like, yeah, like Like I just see a kid and I heard they haven't had a new pair of shoes at their school for so long, so I just reach into my pocket and bought them a pair of sneakers, that that kind of thing. Which obviously, we know that that's just propaganda, but also it's like, yeah, like why is it that a cop has that money to do that? Is because that's where half of the city budget is going. That like, that's where that's the pocket that all the money's in. Yeah, Elliot.
Yeah. So, something that I learned, heard over the last few months and had an experience the other day at the office is the police aren't the only ones down here who have been deputized to make arrests and to make these determinations about people and whether they're committing a crime or not. You have sanitation workers who are now able to arrest you. I mean, it's plain. Let's say it how it is. And so it doesn't have to be someone in a police uniform. It could be the garbage man that puts, those plastic things on you and tells you you're under arrest because you tried to get your bag of medication before we could throw it away. I mean, this isn't just about police. This is about a whole bureaucracy of city and county employees. I'm actually blown away that I can actually be arrested by the garbage man.
Yeah.
For protecting for wanting my property. I mean, really, quite shocking.
Exactly. And so that's part of it is expanding police into every function of government, whether that's obviously, sanitation is a striking example, but obviously teachers, it's social workers. And in places like Skid Row and around the city, it's this private security forces of the business improvement district. And those are actually, it's working with the city attorney, it's working with the housing department. And I think we think sometimes of this, this goofy cops playing basketball and handing out toys on Christmas type shit, which is part of community policing too. But just as much, we need to remember that a big part of the goal of the community policing is to kind of gather information, to develop a broader network that they're gathering information from, whether that's from landlords, NIMBYs, developers, whatever, as well as, like Elliot is now saying, the whole kind of city and county apparatus are all kind of in service of policing, and it's a way of just, connecting all those dots. And not just that, I think, and this is, I hear this in both what Nia is saying and what Elliot is saying, is when you're embedding the role of police, or like Nick is saying, police playing doctor, or police playing social worker, police playing educator, police playing, even parent, in the way that the police like to come and talk about themselves, is there's one is that propaganda role of helping to normalize and make police seem less harmless when we know they're just force for violence. Another is holding our communities hostage, that, sanitation is something that, we are okay with the basic premise of it, just like we are okay with, we believe our communities need resources. But it's those resources are then only delivered kind of at the hands of cop with a gun in the other hand. And so that's why I think when we think about community policing and its roots kind of in counterinsurgency is a term that we use a lot. That's a term that refers to kind of some of the softer ways that police or occupying forces in the military or whatever exercise their control over a place. That's another part of it, is that services that the community needs, they're saying, and we've seen this in the community safety partnership sites that we're organizing in, people have said, communities long been saying, this sidewalk, even shit as simple as this sidewalk is damaged and that's really dangerous, or we need a crosswalk here, or we need, like a light there or whatever. We don't have any money for that. We don't have any money for that. But then kind of police come and do this community safety partnership, community policing endeavor of mapping out what they need, and then suddenly there's resources for it. So you want some stuff for your community, the only way you're going to get it is through police. So that also is kind of, we see it in, when in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and all these places, is that police are using this kind of hearts and minds, or the military is using these kind of hearts and minds approach to do these same three purposes that we're talking about today. One is propaganda, securing kind of, the ascent of assent for violence. And by the way, about that, I want to say is like, it's not even necessarily the assent from the people that they're occupying. Like, they don't actually care about that. Rather, it's assent to keep doing what they're doing from the kind of, from their own apparatus. So you see that in Afghanistan, where the whole approach of the war was this counterinsurgency method of occupation. And the idea was, we're going to be, doing all this soft power, hearts and minds stuff to make sure that there isn't an insurgency and to quell an insurgency. And that's what they would come back to DC and tell the Pentagon that they were doing. And that's what they were kind of claiming they're doing. But what happened within literally like a day of the military, of the like violent aspects of the military withdrawing? Immediately, the Taliban and the kind of insurgent things that they've been telling us for 20 years, they've been doing all this counterinsurgency, shows up. So that means any claim that they're actually stopping insurgency was bullshit. But what it did succeed in doing is convincing the American public, American politicians, the liberal establishment to keep funding the war. And that's same here, is that this counterinsurgency stuff, when they're going and playing, creating a football team or handing out toys, I don't think that's convincing anybody in the actual neighborhood that they're violent in that, oh, police are cool. That's not fooling anyone. But it is fooling their liberal backers. It is fooling, city council. It is fooling politicians to be able to, keep securing what they need. Yeah, Mamta?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess maybe echo that, but also say there's like a large role that that nonprofits play in community policing. I mean, we're talking about the expansion of like the city and county bureaucracy, right? Like they've definitely been able to envelop all of these other like, city agencies into their fold. But increasingly here, especially in San Francisco, like there's just so many nonprofits that like ally themselves with these community policing operations, and not just nonprofits, but of course, like all the progressives love it. So like it really is. And I guess the other thing I was going to say is that it really is, there's clearly, it's a response to like a crisis of legitimacy that the police are facing. I recently read like a grant that the San Francisco Police Department applied for, and it was one of these predictive policing programs that had all this like community policing stuff built in. And a lot of what they were writing just in like why they need the funds is to say, people are losing trust in police. Like we need to build trust amongst the people we police. And so like it really is, especially in the wake of like the uprisings in 2020, I feel like this is the face of the counterinsurgency. It's things like, nonprofits helping the police, or like city departments, or, from the prosecutors to the public defenders to everybody who like cares about the poor, quote, poor people. It's like a lot of like this also channels all this like, poverty porn, right? Like just like this idea, we're going to go into the community and teach kids like how to play basketball so they can have like a play, all that garbage. But like, it's really meant to address this deep crisis of legitimacy that the police are facing in our society. And so like, part of like the question that I have is like, how do we actively counter this? Because everybody and their mother drinks this Kool-Aid, right? And so like, even in like most spaces you're in, it's very hard to sort of expose this. Like they'll have, one of the things they have here is like these safety walks, for women. Like it's all like empowering women to be out late, and we're having these safety walks and like invite all the community, all the nonprofits in the neighborhood, all the people, kind of like all the women's organizations, things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's I do kind of wonder, like, what do you like show up at one of these community walks and like protest, or just like, how do you sort of expose these guys for the garbage that it is?
Yeah, So I think there's so much that you shared, and you know, it's absolutely true that it's kind of it's generally like progressives and liberals and the nonprofit establishment that is most complicit in pushing community policing. You know, just and even, you know, community policing originates from the 1994 crime bill that you know, Joe Biden was architect of and that he's pushing all this funding for now. And so I think that's a good place maybe to transition into like what we're doing to fight back. I mean, I think one thing I'll say when you're asking about these safety walks is that was also a key component of the early community policing in Skid Row. When Bill Bratton, new police chief, showed up. He kind of he knew that, okay, that, and it's along the lines that Elliot is saying, as well as with the nonprofits and stuff, of that to multiply the force of police, we need to kind of bring them into collaboration with the local business owners, local developers, other agencies. And so they started doing these safety walks here. And there's a long history of LA Can, and that was a big part of, I mean, I think Hamid and maybe Elliot and Pancake, probably others, can share a little bit about you know, the work that y'all did to disrupt those safety walks. So if you want to share on that, and then maybe we'll transition to
Yeah, this was an extension of very much, and this was Carmen Trutanich, who was the city attorney at the time. His name was Trutanich, so Dogon had named him False Tanich. So he would bring in students and developers, and you know, and it was really making a mockery of residents of Skid Row, as if the people were on display, and like a tour bus or a tour guide, the city attorney is the tour guide, and Central Division, you know, just police are escorting them. And there are all of these developers and students who are just kind of looking at these. I mean, it boggles your mind. It's like they're in a zoo or something, and they're looking at people. So of course we organized and we harassed the heck out of them, which led to you know, a lot of fights. You know, this was when those pictures when my leg was broken and I had a full leg cast in the wheelchair. So that wheelchair became a parking lot for our placards. So I had to carry those placards in my lap, and Pete got arrested. Debbie Burton got hit with 8 felonies. Who was a resident of Skid Row and an organizer at LA Can for using an air horn. But to your point, that's exactly what it needed to happen. But, you know, and finally they stopped because of all the community action and the organizing we did. But it's just one of those extremely gross, again, example of community policing. And I think this is what maybe, if I'm correct, if I understand it correctly, that you are just, I mean, this whole idea that, Akhil, what you were kind of just digging in as well, that, you know, that how these become these, yeah, anyways, this become a whole mockery of people with this understanding that, well, we're on this together, cops and people are holding hands, you know, safe passages for our kids, you know, women can now walk safely because of those people over there. So that's why it is very much counterinsurgency.
Yeah, and so that's part of it, is just like showing up, disrupting, delegitimizing, denormalizing it in that way. But I think what the question that you're getting at is a hard one of, like, you know, this stuff is like catnip for liberals. They love to hear about community policing, even though the term doesn't mean anything. Every year it's just brought up again as, oh, okay, we're going to shift to community policing. Today I saw Rick Caruso, the right-wing mayoral candidate. He's talking about how, you know, during his term as mayor, he I think what he says, cracked down on police brutality by promoting, and he said community-based policing, which is even funnier. It's like, well, like, as opposed to like what, like, where would is it gonna be? Like, obviously it's based in the community as opposed to like based in space or something. But you know, I think that it's just a nonsense term that people then like. But how do we actually narrate the harm and impact of it and what it's like to experience it? I mean, in the report, we do quote a little bit of, here, I'll just kind of share real quick, a little bit of like some individual testimonials from people who have, you know, were in some of these sites where it was, where the programs are deployed, and people are describing just like, you know, harassment and cops just going around and throwing everyone's information into databases and just harassing all the youth and all of that. He says, we've seen how the police take photos of them nude and put their names in the database. It's labeling people as gang members or criminals. If you're Latino, it's worse. And then another person says they reinforce these areas with police, so if people are removed, they happen to come back, the police, that it's kind of just being used to facilitate, displacement and evictions. But we want to dive more into that, as well as to expose, like you're saying, Mamta, that it's always when police are facing this crisis and criticism and uprisings, when they're quickly community policing. And so on both of those points, we have some kind of organizing efforts that I think Mamta and Nii are going to share. But first, I see some hands, so maybe Elliot, maybe I'll go with Hannah first, since you've been raising your hand a lot.
Hi, it's really lovely to meet everyone. I'm in Montreal right now, so it's my first time at this meeting. I'm really curious to hear, because we're sort of talking about the propagandizing of police forces, how like liberal media, and specifically how indoctrinated liberals, and even to some extent like liberal not liberals but progressives, certainly not like leftists, but people who identify more as progressives, how we can get them to sort of see the harm that policing is causing, because they're so sort of indoctrinated with this. And to an extent, even when I'm in progressive spaces that claim to support houseless populations, or folks who are struggling with addiction, or criminal record, or housing insecurity, there's this resistance to, okay, well, I'm not completely like a pro-abolition across the board. I think we need to keep some people locked up. I think we need some policing for this. What do you think would be the best alternative to this?
Yeah, what do people think? Anyone want to jump in on that? How do we, Kim.
There's this, so the question that I always get is, how are we going to punish sexual assault and serial killers, right? And really serious traumatic things like that. And I always like to say, well, and Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore always say, the thing about abolition is not really destroying, but building up, right? Communities, building up resources where someone doesn't feel comfortable to sexually assault someone, right? Because that shouldn't happen to begin with. And there's this really good piece by Insight, I think Insight co-wrote it with Critical Resistance, about how even abolitionists circles, right, don't really have an answer for that, because we're not prioritizing women and femmes and women and femme safety. So even thinking about that, and I don't know, like, I feel like people just really come at you with like, that's impossible, like da 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 da. And it's like, well, these are the ways that I'm, disrupting this like logic of I'm gonna call 911. For example, talk to your neighbors, right? A lot of literally so many things can be avoided if people just like were okay with confrontation and had those conversations. But gentrifiers love to just call the police on anyone and anything that bothers them. So I feel like there has to be a conversation around like, just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean you get to like sanction violence onto someone, right? Because police are deadly, and that just needs to get out of the question. Like, I'm gonna call police for noise nuisance, or I'm gonna call police for all these like small things. So yeah, I feel you. I feel like there's always these questions of like, how are we gonna do this? How are we gonna do that? And I feel like Angela Davis, like, mostly taught us that first we need to divert all these resources that are going into policing to resources that make our communities healthy and alive and well. So there's no point in like robbing someone, right? Because we all have enough to eat and we're not like working ourselves to death. and we have access to mental health resources, so we don't turn to substances, and all these other things. Because in reality, like, sexual assault is about power, you know, pedophilia and all those things that people love to like throw at you when you're talking about abolition. All of that is about power, the way we treat women, femmes, and children. And, you know, that's not something that we can change overnight, but I feel like we can definitely implement some of those values into our everyday, into our community organizing, into our friendships.
Yeah, Akil, do you want to share? And thank you, Kim. I don't know if we can. Oh, yeah, I don't know what happened to Akil.
Yeah, he's, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'll just say that speaking as somebody who definitely grew up like a progressive or a liberal and is in the process constantly of unlearning that. A big part of it for me was shifting the way I thought about the question from seeing the police as like primarily like there to fulfill some service, but then it's just can't help but being racist, to like the service is a pretext for the real goal, which is like a domestic genocidal war. And like to the extent that other people are caught up in this war on Black people or like impacted by the system that was designed primarily to, you know, exterminate, lock up Black people, like it kind of carries this illusion that it's like part of, it's like, oh, it's just part of a municipality, that there's got to be police, and then like we have to spend a lot of time on this question, like how would we replace every single one of the quote unquote services that it fulfills. And I think that for me, really the key part of like realizing that you don't have to have an answer to all of those questions in order to support abolition is fundamentally seeing the state itself as illegitimate, seeing it as a squatter colonial state on stolen land, and seeing the police as its, you know, the part of its military that is deployed on the parts of its land that it considers to be domestic, but they're really also foreign occupations, you know? And when you kind of like slowly shift to that mindset, then you realize like, like in the part of the program where we're like trying to figure out how to do this shit, we do have to kind of think about answers to all those questions, but we don't have to have those answers to consider that the goal from the outset, because they're not there fundamentally to do those services. They're there to kill and lock up Black people. So we can oppose that and you know, oppose the entire system as a whole, you know, without knowing exactly what'll happen to, you know, this type of harm or this type of harm.
Thanks. Yeah. And then, you know, when police are proposing their latest, like, you know, give us 3 billion more for this or that, no one is asking them to prove anything besides, because the people who are investing in it either quietly or loudly know that what the purpose is, and that's what they want. Nancy, I see your hand also. You want to share about this question, or?
Yeah, I'd like to reply to Hannah's point. In full transparency, I work at, you know, a nonprofit that allies themselves with law enforcement to service, well, supposedly service survivors of sexual assault. And in my couple years of working there, I just have noticed that unfortunately, when somebody wants some kind of civil action or counseling or housing, really any service, even if it's free, they usually have to prove it with some sort of document, whether or on the local and state level. And it's really unfortunate because that, you know, requires them to cooperate with law enforcement to some degree. And so just as like a brainstorm or not like a solution, but is there a way, because I know someone else brought up the nonprofits, like maybe this can be a point of change where nonprofits or even like other local organizations can provide services. And I'm not talking about the grassroots organizations or mutual aid funds, but is that a way to change that and to lessen the community and survivors like interactions and cooperation with law enforcement to make it so that nonprofits don't have to receive or can receive funding without the cooperation of law enforcement. I know that's more like a policy thing, but talking about small incremental changes, not necessarily reaching like the full goal or the full solution in like one swoop, but that's just something that's come to mind for me because there are a lot of folks who, once they are in a domestic violence situation or stalking or sexual assault, and they realize that, law enforcement's not going to remedy that. They're likely not going to investigate it. Like nothing's going to happen. Those are people who are quickly radicalized into like, oh, I was victimized and law enforcement did nothing. And so I think there's a lot of like, a lot of those folks and like energy there. And people who have just, continually been from all walks of life, obviously mostly Black and Brown communities, but yeah, that's just like one thing that I've noticed and that, I've been like wondering, is that like a grant issue where like if you apply for a grant, is this something that we can like, advocate for on like the state level of saying like, provide more funding for orgs that don't require survivors to work with law enforcement to receive services, because that's just another way, like everyone was saying, to fund law enforcement for something that a service they don't provide. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Nancy. And yeah, I mean, to me, just, on the surface, that sounds like a worthy thing to be pushing for, is that, why is it that nonprofits need kind of police verification before they go into something? I think we kind of know the answer to that. Part of it is because they're invested in some extent in that system. But yeah, pushing for that. And, even when you were explaining that, I was thinking this when Kim was sharing earlier, that like, this people, when they'll say like, okay, if there's no police, like who's going to address the sexual assaults and rapes, and who's going to be responsible for addressing that? And it's like, who's responsible for addressing that now? It's obviously not police. Like there is no, like, that's not one preventing anything, nor even when something happens, police have no role in doing anything and or solving or ensuring any accountability, except in a really small fraction of even the reported cases. So that's why I think so much of abolitionist organizing that at least I'm aware of and kind of admire around the country is led by survivors of sexual violence, people who actually know that, yeah, the system is not protecting anyone, and that's why we need to think, that's why we need to get rid of it. Kim, I saw you had your hand up a moment ago, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, just thank you so much, Nancy, for voicing that. Like a couple of years back, I went through a DV situation, and as someone that didn't want to involve police, right, everyone was leading me back to, you need to make a report, you need to make a report. So I feel like, as I guess being involved in this work, like I myself didn't even know what to do or where to turn without involving police, without involving like possible deportation, right, for the other party and XYZ, and that doesn't look like justice to me, right? So even thinking about like how like we have a rapid response, right, for ICE, and I'm like, maybe I'm just not well connected, but I feel like there's very few resources that are for DV specifically, right? And I myself have been trying to get like trained to de-escalate DV situations. So very much echoing what Nancy was saying, and how even, I think I went to like Peace Over Violence, and they're like, yeah, you need a police report first, or So we have like no other option to document things that actually happen to us other than police. And even that is like, you know, is that going to be documented accurately or correctly? So even I guess thinking about like structures that, or not structures, but resources that we can put up as we fight to dismantle police and the carceral state, right? I feel like that's definitely a need.
Elliot, do you want to share here still?
Yeah, kind of actually, and Kim, I guess was the name of the last person who spoke. Asked what I wanted to say, like, you know, how do we document that? Well, very simply, we take out our phones and we start videotaping. When we see the police harassing young Black women and young Black men, we record it. When we are ourselves being harassed or, you know, bothered by the police, take out the phone and record it. That's a great way to start documenting what's going on in whatever area you're in. And these videos can become ways that we can show the public the damage that police are doing and the better way of handling each situation that's being recorded. So yeah, there's documentation of all of this is important. And I have my video, my phone, whatever you want to call it, my smart device on video all the time. I'm constantly videotaping stuff police are doing down here. So that's something to think about.
Yeah. And yeah, and it's just building that culture of whether it's cop watching or resisting or monitoring, recording, all of these things. Then not any one of them is going to obviously end all of this, but it's building that whole culture of resistance that I think the watching is a big part of. So yeah, I know I see we have just with a couple of minutes left. Well, and hold on, I see a comment from EP that there's countless recordings were oversaturated or almost oversituated. Yeah. And I think that's also true, that there is also, especially, you know, I think we need to be that I mean, Elliot, I think you described it as an urgent call, and I hear that, but also there's some sensitivity of like, you know, not trying to over sensationalize this harm enough, and people are obviously, you know, being harassed and abused, that's oversaturating the public consciousness with those images also in a way kind of helps desensitize it, normalize it, and that can be a problem too, especially because we fucking know that it's going on. There's a lot of images and videos and history of it.
It's a very fine line to walk. I understand that, but it's a necessary line to walk. I mean,
yeah. Okay, so maybe I think this is a good place also, as we're talking about kind of the resistance to this stuff. I don't know who, I know both Nina and Matthias were going to share some of the work that our community policing work group, which, yeah, I guess we should have mentioned up front. We have a work group that is devoted to organizing against these community policing programs and exposing their harm. And one thing that we have coming out of that work group soon is a zine about the connection of community policing and all these reforms to uprisings. Another thing is a survey. So I don't know who wants to jump in first, and I'll pass it on.
Yeah, I can kick us off. I'm gonna share screen real quick, everyone, so folks can take a look and a sneak peek at the zine that we have been working on. And this specific zine, it's looking at, and as Shakir stated, it comes from the Community Policing Working Group. So it started off with a group of folks coming together to put together this timeline about instances of community policing and how it shows up throughout the years and the different tactics that they've utilized. And then from that community policing working group, we decided to kind of make the information a little bit more accessible by breaking it down into different like themes and different things that we wanted to highlight. One of the first ones being a zine, and I'm not sure if Mathios, if you would want to talk about that in a little bit, about the chief scene. But the second one is this scene that you're seeing right now, and it's a working title. It's still in the works, but it's essentially about the breakup with the state, abolishing our relationships with abusive states. And it's in what folks are naming about how like those questions that are asked often, and I've gotten it a few times as well about like, yeah, what are we going to do with the rapist? What are we going to do with all these things? When in reality, like, yeah, that those networks don't really exist. And those forms of violence, I think, like the truth is on our side. Like we don't say this like because we're kind of creating this out of thin air, but because of lived experience where we know the ongoing that like police and the police state are like intentionally there to cause harm. And so until we get into the root of the fact that like, especially in the context of the United Settler colonies or the United Settler states, that we're rooted in, or like the US is rooted in violence. And so you can't really, like, until you get to the root of that, you can't really, our communities aren't going to be safe, not with these reforms. And then it specifically just looks at the history of through the Watts, Rodney King, and George Floyd, the three uprisings, just looking at how different reform efforts were put into place by the state, and how there was a huge push for things like body cameras, and how body cameras like are often not provided, or when they are provided, are heavily edited and provided to fit LAPD's narrative. Or I know I believe Adam had mentioned CPAP, so the Community Police Advisory Boards, and even recently we see the CPAPs being utilized with or this push for technology oversight. So just looking at the different forms of community policing, but how like a lot of those things that kind of whether it's patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, how like all of these things and how it affects our intersecting identities, is really, it's rooted in how like the state also has justified like othering us as well. And so that kind of harm continues to be replicated, because if the state is providing that, and treats us the way it treats us, then it gives agency and legitimacy for anyone else to see it, whether it's our interpersonal relationships. But yeah, it goes into that, and those three different reforms. But if folks are interested in supporting or in coming out to the community policing working groups, that's something that we are going to be meeting on Thursday. And before we hop off the call, I'll share the calendar invite, so that way if folks would want to join our community policing working group, where we're kind of finalizing the language and hoping to put that out there. Yeah, we're going to be finalizing that in the next, hopefully the next within the month, but our running joke is 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Nee. And thank you, Hamid, for dropping the link to all our zines. I'm also going to talk briefly about the zine that Nee was talking about, which is called the a chief by chief history of LAPD community policing and counterinsurgency. And that's kind of rooted in the fact that, like Shakir was talking about, this language in the SARS program of reasonable indication. That's a reform. So many other things that the LAPD does that are egregious, like the militarization of policing, in which is a mainstream, I think, criticism by most people on the left, is also a reform. And we know that that's a reform that came from Chief Parker. And so we kind of looked at this notion of community policing through the lens of history and highlighted individual chiefs and how they came to play. And then the other thing we kind of wanted to talk about was within our community policing program, we Oh, and that Chief by Chief zine was done largely in part. The art is incredible. It's by Quincy Clemens from Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And I also need to shout out Jason Reedy, who's a coordinating team member in the coalition, who also did a great deal of work on that zine. But another thing we're working on right now within the community policing work group is just talking to people in CSP sites. And if folks don't know what CSP sites are, you can check out that nocsp.org. I was going to show the video, but it's we don't really have much time left. But there's a video there done by LA CAN, Stop LAPD Spying, and the Othering and Belonging Institute that sums up the CSP program. It started in 2011. It became a bureau in 2020. And so let me screen share and I'll show the survey we developed. And this is really a survey that the coalition made in the past, but we've kind of largely revamped. Geez. It's here somewhere. Apologies, friends. Here we go. Okay. And so the goal is to, we've made contact with community members who live in CSP sites, and we want to take this over to them and, kind of assess how they feel, what their experiences are, what we can learn from them living in these CSP sites. But yeah, that's something that's going on. You can plug in with. And we'd love to hear what people kind of think. I can also answer any questions about this or the prior zine, or me, I'm so sorry if you want to chime in with anything about this.
Yeah, I just want to add real quick. So the CSP, the Community Safety Partnerships, I believe I'm getting that right. They have a shit ton of acronyms, but the CSP sites are like specifically the surveillance that they are putting policing programs specifically in housing projects. So some of that included going into the areas, taking photos and being like, oh, we need a light here. Even if the community asked for it like decades ago or years ago, and they never got the lights because they don't do anything for the good of the community, but now are coming and saying, oh, we need it because we need to be able to capture them on camera, or it's a better tool for surveillance. And so the ways in which, like police departments act as armed social work is definitely something that we see locally, and as well we see it everywhere.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. Really appreciate it. Well, folks, that basically, any comments or closing comments or thoughts or questions anybody has? It's actually CSP, Community Safety Partnership. Well, thank you once again for joining us. And here's our email address, our handle you can reach out to, or go to the website. There's a whole bunch of different resources. This next Tuesday is our 4th Tuesday of the month, which will be data-driven policing and how it about the LAPD. That's our primary focus. There's a lot of fights. There's a lot of different working groups that folks can join. If you want to, we have a very robust working group around academic complicity, around community policing, around the LAPD's SARA models, the scanning analysis, assessment, response, and analysis. We have a record management system that we are mapping out. There's a whole, a big push, and that's been central to our work. Nina is leading a whole bunch of work around the popular education. Join us to make zines or other stuff as well, videos if you're interested. The war on youth, I can't talk enough about it because this is such an awesome space the last week and this week. And I think, and I'm going to be there tomorrow as well to join in. We're doing a whole summer, 1 hour a day with first through 5th graders. And Akhil, who's here, has this beautiful video on our Instagram account where Akhil is talking to 1st through 5th graders about policing and building power. And it's phenomenal. Just love it. So totally go check it out. So join the fight. And I'm going to leave you all with this video about the counterinsurgency piece. And as we tune out, it's about 3 minutes. So hang in there and we will just call it a day. Okay. Share sound. Oops, share.
The legacy of community policing in Los Angeles is one of racism and social control. We know the dark history of police partnering with government and real estate developers to maintain and strengthen state and corporate power. Community policing began in the 1960s and 70s with the presumed intent of building trust between police and the community. A deeper look at community policing reveals a drastically different reality. The strategy of community policing is a form of combat operation and social control deployed by the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's called counterinsurgency. It was the military that taught the LAPD how to become an occupying army to protect the status quo for future private development opportunities. This is another example of how police use the scam of reform to secure more resources and power. Tech companies that supply the surveillance hardware and software, and the university professors who provide justification for community policing are all accomplices to this dirty deed. In 2011, the LAPD and the City Housing Authority launched the Community Safety Partnerships in 4 public housing projects in South Central Los Angeles. Now a growing line item in LAPD's budget, the program was originally set in motion through federal funding from the 1994 crime bill, along with money from philanthropy, real estate developers, and other wealthy elite. They worked together to displace and gentrify Black and brown communities while helping to secure white wealth. Alongside the Housing Authority, the LAPD displaces and arrests residents on a massive scale, while collecting data accessible to agencies like ICE.
What that looked like was a lot of surveillance and harassment of forest residents, to the point where a lot of residents spoke of not being able to sit outside on a hot day for fear of police interaction, just in their own home, in the vicinity of their own doorway.
This is how spying happens in LA.
This is how the erosion of our human rights happens in LA.
This is how social control and gentrification happen in LA.
This is how police secure bigger budgets and more resources. Despite repeated attempts to pacify and control us, we have always fought against this kind of policing, because a paramilitary occupying force is not what makes our communities safe.
We question.
We fight back.
We fight back.
We organize.
Organize. We fight for a community free of police surveillance, police violence, and harm.
We reclaim the resources we deserve to thrive and survive.
Together.
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 Join us.
Yeah, join us. Where the heck are you guys? All right, cool. Well, good. Well, thank you all very much. Have a great evening, and wherever you are, be healthy, be safe, and we look forward to building together. And we will abolish. We will dismantle. So, thank you very much. Have a great night. Bye-bye.